very much. First, just for those of you who have not been part of this, this initiative in the last couple of years, a bit of background. It came out actually as a brainchild from a meeting of the National Academy of Medicine, that used to be called the Institute of Medicine. And it was a workshop entitled Financial Incentives to Encourage Development of Therapies that Address Unmet Medical Needs and Nervous System Disorders. And it was during that discussion, I was not part of this, so several in this room were, that it was suggested by by a couple of the leaders of the group, particularly Dr. Coetzee of MS, he's also an MD PhD, and Dr. Dennis Choi from the SUNY Stony Brook, who co-chairs the panel. It was suggested it would be helpful if the group looked to a non-profit group, patient-oriented, generalist-oriented, that could help maybe define some of these things and to help the government and the other research agencies define their priorities in ways that reflect patient needs and patterns. And that was when ABC was invited to take on this mantle, and our task force was created. It was really an attempt to use the resources that we have, particularly the very deep connection with 97, 98 patient groups, I think it is, Katie, something like that we have in our population, and turn that resource, which is really National's resource, to the attention as to what kinds of things we could then be doing to advance neuroscience research. There's a factoid that all of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. I learned it myself several years ago when the task force was created, that shows this astonishing trend or non-trend in the attention to brain disorders as compared with other areas of medical research. 50% decline overall, we figured, in the number of dollars that we're going to research in the nervous system among companies, corporate America. The drug industry as a whole had reduced in real dollars the investments in creating products and the science that goes behind that by 50% over a decade. And the reasons, obviously we have the time or I have the confidence to discuss all of those, but the reasons bear looking at, and the results of that kind of rhetoric bears attention from our community, and particularly the ABC, which is how we created this task force. It was an attempt to see how we could look at the differences in investments in the various medical states and see how we could find mechanisms, incentives, regulatory, perhaps some legislative changes that would then correct this picture. And that was why we started and how we started. We've done our best in the last couple of years to come up with then a way of looking at this that is both practical, doable, and in the range within the sort of the ballpark and mindset of the ABC. We came up with 4 areas, which we're about to hear from professional counsel on this, that we believe that could take some really very serious examination by the society as a whole, but also by ABC in particular. And so the objective of this session this afternoon, we had an earlier session discussing it on the board earlier today, to look at those 4 areas, see how they resonate with people who really know a great deal, either as lay people and patient groups or as scientists, about how we can then turn this to good use. And so that was the business of our task force. The results of the four sections we'll hear from Celia on right now, and we would hope there'll be some time at the end for those in the room to give comments, or later on, as it is far from a picture already done and ready to hang. We would like very much to hear from you as thoughts occur to you following the meeting. So I think if we can then look at Celia's slide and get ready with this sequence of 4 areas that survived the inspection that we gave over the last 2 years. She will discuss in detail, then there'll be time, I hope, for questions and comments on that. Celia, thank you very much. Oh, the members. Yes, the members. They have this. Oh, they have a slide. Yeah. You see the members of the task force. It was led, I mentioned the two figures at the beginning who helped put this whole thing in place, Dr. Kosi and Dr. Choi, who were our chairs. And I was given the very challenging but very happy job of coordinating our members in making sense of all this. Dr. Karen Smith, known to many of you in this room, neuroscientist in her own right, and a fine person who works with patient groups and professional groups with great skill. Amy Rick, who's a government and a government relations person, known again to many of you. Dr. Kittredge, Frank Kittredge, who was a chair, I'm going to say, to the American Academy of Neurology, brings so much to the table, also works in the business of research, the business of creating pharmaceuticals, and several others. Kathy Rydell, I'm not sure she's in the room now. Kathy, of course, as the president of the Academy, enormously important in her contributions to this. And most recently, and Ajahn, her husband, made a very strong statement at our last meeting earlier this month about how we need to pay attention to the pricing of drugs as well as the development of drugs, because without appropriate attention to this, the drugs aren't going to get to the people that they need to get to. Ted Thompson from Parkinson's, who a colleague of mine, works for the Michael J. Fox Foundation, a lawyer as well as a person in this area. Andrew Sperling is in the room now, who's at JD, and very, very active. It's a fine group. We're very lucky to have them. Janet Highshatter herself, our retiring chair of the group. So it's been a very, very good group. I hope they felt as engaged and as useful as I certainly have felt through the 2-year period. So let's see where we are in our work in progress. I turn it over to Celia. Celia?
Thank you, Robin. So as Robin said, I'm going to go over a little bit of background information, set the frame, set the problem of what we're trying to accomplish here, and then discuss a little bit about the process of how the task force came to the recommendations that they presented to the board just a little while ago, and then we'll present what the board voted on for action moving forward. So a little bit about some of the therapeutic development issues in the neuroscience space. As Robin said, there's been a lot of private divestment in neuroscience R&D programs. There are several studies out there that show this and indicate that this is a rising trend. One of these studies documented between 2009 and 2014 that CNS portfolios decreased from about 267 to 129. A more recent development that you've probably seen in the news is that in 2018, Pfizer dropped its Alzheimer's and Parkinson's research programs. And as you know, ABCI2, the task force was really interested in understanding why this was happening. I think this is a general slide, not specific to CNS. Product development, but just generally drug development, drug discovery and development is a risky business. There's this valley of death that happens in the clinical trial phase. It's an expensive process to go from the pre-discovery to actually having effective therapy or treatment for CNS disorders. And it takes a very long time. The investment, not only monetarily, but also taking time to, on average, 10 to 15 years from going to from step A to all the way having a product that would be used within patients to help them improve their quality of life. So there's that. There is a more specific study. It's one of the only ones that I think specifically looks at CNS. This was done through the Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development. That actually looked at clinical trials that were done for CNS products. This was an analysis that was done between 2000 and 2017. They found that the mean clinical time development was 20% longer for CNS than non-CNS. And then on the regulatory side, the approval side, the mean clinical phase length times were 38% longer for CNS than non-CNS disorders. So the report does not explore the reasoning behind these differences, but it appears that for other, compared to other disease areas that are benefiting from improvement in the time of development and the regulatory time, that CNS is not seeing the same improvements. So that takes us to the ABC Innovation Initiative, or ABCI2, as Robin has mentioned. He gave a little bit of background about the development of this from the IOM workshop, and how ABC has sort of taken us on to determine further explore activities that the association can take to address this unmet need of CNS products to treat disorders and conditions. So I just wanted to put this up here, not only want to frame the next few slides of what we're working towards, but also to understand that ABCI2 had some very specific goals from the beginning. There are 4 of them. The first one is to enhance public awareness of the importance of both public and private sector engagement in brain research to improve upon current treatments and cures. Second is really focused on public-private partnerships, developing projects and initiatives to advance brain research and commercial development. The third is to create programs that result in greater confidence in neuroscience R&D programs to encourage that investment. And finally, number 4, generally increase private sector investment in CNS treatment to reverse that slide, that trend we're seeing of them exiting the neuroscience R&D space. So as the task force deliberated, had their discussions, did their research, we really framed all of our activities around these 4 goals, and you will see these 4 goals kind of pulled through in a lot of the activities, the recommendations that we've made moving forward. Some of the more recent activities that we have done, we had a task force meeting, in-person meeting on October 1st in Washington, D.C. This was a continuation of discussions and deliberations that the task force had previously. We had determined that over the summer, some additional research needed to be conducted over some of these incentivization mechanisms that have been used or have been discussed to understand what those look like and how they can be applied to the CNS area. So we did some research, a literature review, to specifically look at if these incentivization mechanisms, we are familiar with them in concept, but do they actually, what's the effectiveness of them to actually stimulate innovation? What's the impact of them to actually lead new drugs and devices through the pipeline to the patients? We also looked at an analysis of these mechanisms in the current political climate. The original IOM, or the National Academy of Medicine study, was done back in 2015. As you know, the political climate has changed drastically since that time, and so we felt like it was important to reevaluate how these mechanisms would work in this current political environment. If they were still viable, are there other considerations we need to take into consideration? And then finally, the ultimate objective of the task force was to develop recommendations to the board, to present them to the board, have the board vote on those activities, and then ultimately we were here at our final destination to present the decisions and the activities moving forward to the membership. So some of the considerations that we took as we were considering the strategies and moving forward, the task force discussed a number of different incentivization mechanisms. One thing that we looked at was trying to understand their proven merit in other disease areas, if they were applicable specifically in the CNS space. We thought about that as well, but many of these incentivization mechanisms have been used in other disease areas, rare diseases, neglected tropical diseases, the antimicrobial drug development. And so we looked at it from a lens that was a little bit broader than just CNS. We also, as I mentioned earlier, trying to understand the political viability of each of these incentivization mechanisms or activities, and also understanding what each of these mechanisms, are they realistic under ABC's mission, vision, and resources? So trying to understand if each of these recommendations that we're making can be reasonably implemented by ABC. And finally, as Robin had mentioned, we also took into account affordability. As we all know, drug pricing, the rising costs of healthcare is something that is very acute on both Capitol Hill in terms of policymaking and also within this administration. So we are aware of the force of rising drug costs in healthcare in policy developments, and we're aware that with some of our own recommendations, if they were left unchecked, could contribute to that price inflation among CNS products. So we specifically wanted to make sure that we kept affordability as a foundational tether as we explored these mechanisms, and that ABC will continue to keep abreast of the drug pricing policy developments on the Hill moving forward. So from here, I will tell you a little bit about the strategies that were approved by the board of directors just about, I don't know, an hour ago. So this is all hot off the press. The first activity that ABC will be taking on is exploring the use of an adaptive approval pathway at FDA for repurposed therapeutics to incentivize CNS product development. The context of this is that the task force had considered a conditional approval pathway in our discussions and our deliberations, and with the political controversy and some of the controversy that is in the community about conditional approval, we decided to pivot more towards an adaptive approval pathway for repurposed therapeutics that would use therapeutics that have already been approved, FDA approved for another indication, to repurpose those, use those off-label to see if those would be appropriate for CNS. The activities that would be taken on by ABC is to determine the need to conduct additional research on the feasibility of this. So we're in the very beginning stages of framing what this would look like and how this would work. So doing research on what this would look like, and establish a work group to discuss the parameters around what an adaptive approval pathway for repurposed therapeutics would look like. The impact of doing an activity like this is that once the work group could establish this framework, it can be used to gather support from stakeholders. I think we all know that when you're talking about something of this magnitude, it's important that you have partners in this, and so this framework can be used as a tool to help educate other stakeholders what ABC is trying to accomplish here. Ultimately, the impact here is that the repurposed therapeutics would be pushed into phase 3 clinical trials that would ultimately increase the chances of more therapeutics to treat CNS conditions. The second activity is more focused around legislation. This is to explore the use of tax credits to incentivize research and development investments in neuroscience. So there's actually been some activity that has been ongoing with one of ABC's members, One Mind, who has been working with the Ways and Means Committee on a concept of tax credits to incentivize R&D in neuroscience. ABC through CRD has been part of those conversations, has been looped into the discussions that have been happening. I would like to mention that this is not in draft legislation. This is not anything that's on paper. It's been talked about, and so there's a lot of unknowns, and it's still being developed. And so one of the things that we intend to do is to continue to have ABC at the table during those discussions, to help influence those discussions and make sure that we feel that they're including all of the concepts that ABC wants to move forward. In addition to that specific legislation or concept that One Mind is doing, we will also monitor any legislation that could impact the level and quality of private investment in neuroscience through tax credits. The impact of this is to, if there is a bill that is introduced or drafted, because ABC will have been part of those conversations, we will be able to make an informed decision fairly quickly on what to do next. It also helps us keep abreast of any legislation around R&D tax credits and keep us primed to be able to take any action on anything that comes up. The third activity is to develop a health economic study of alternative mechanisms to incentivize CNS product development. Now, this is large in scope, but through discussions with the task force and the board, we determined that this was something that was very important to ABC. The initial steps here that would happen would be to develop the initial parameters and scope of a health economic study on incentivization mechanisms for CNS product development. So bringing together a work group that can think through this, sketch out a framework to start discussing how this would be done, and also determine a mechanism to conduct this study. How would this be done? Would it need to be done with a contractor? Could we use other resources to fund something of this magnitude? The impact of doing a health economic study, one of the things that we found, and one of the things that was very important, both to the task force and the board, as CRD did some of the research over the summer about these different incentivization mechanisms, was, are they actually doing anything? Are the mechanisms actually effective? Do they bring new products to the market? And as I was doing my research, I couldn't really answer that question. There are very few studies out there that actually look at the impact of each of these mechanisms. So one of the purposes of doing this health economic study is to gain a better evidence-based understanding of what incentivization mechanism would have the greatest impact specifically for CNS. It would inform next actions and impact of a resource-intensive effort if one of these specific mechanisms were to be pursued at a later date by ABC. And having that information ultimately may increase the chances of success because you can put your resources in the right place. The fourth and final activity that was approved today was to increase collaboration across CNS partners and others involved in health research and services. So this is really getting at some of the first two goals of the ABCI2 initiative, is to work on pursuing public-private partnerships, abbreviated here as PPP. One of the objectives here is to develop educational materials to help members pursue public-private partnerships. Throughout our discussions on the task force, we found that many of the individual organizations within ABC have engaged in many public-private partnership relationships. And so we want to help enable ABC members individually to pursue those public-private partnerships on their own. We're also interested, as Samantha was talking about with the BRAIN Initiative, discussing their activities with the public-private partnerships and to do some more informal engagement with the BRAIN Initiative on this issue. There are a lot of other partners that are not specifically in the CNS space that are working on innovation in either drug development or device development. One of these organizations is known as Faster Cures. They are housed under the Milken Institute. They have a lot of really interesting reports about different mechanisms, different models, nonprofit models that sort of disrupt the traditional product development pipeline. So having a conversation with them, learning from the expertise, the knowledge that's housed at Faster Cures is something that the task force feels that ABC could benefit from. And then generally participate in other organizations' forums that address public-private partnerships, nonprofit engagement to ensure that CNS has a presence during these conversations. The impact of this effort is really to enable members to pursue their own public-private partnerships to further their own organization's mission and vision, envisioning that ABC could be a resource to them as they embark on these pursuits. Also to educate members on other types of product development partnerships, nonprofit models. I had mentioned Faster Cures has a lot of resources on this. Just think about product development sort of in a different way. It will also help enhance partner awareness beyond the CNS space on the unmet need for CNS treatments and therapies. It will help position ABC as a well-respected organization within the innovation space, and it will broaden the network of partners that would ultimately lead to other opportunities for engagement for ABC. So those are the four approved action or strategies that the board approved just this afternoon. One of the initial action items that you should all be aware of that you will be hearing soon from ABC is that in order to inform a lot of these activities moving forward, one of the things that a thread throughout all of those 4 strategies is that we felt that ABC, in order to execute these, needs some more information from its membership. One of the first activities that we will be doing is a survey of ABC's membership to understand some of the existing public-private partnerships that you're engaged in currently. Any information about off-label use for therapeutics to help inform the adaptive approval pathway that we're looking at for repurposed therapeutics. How insurance coverage and payment policies work for off-label use of therapeutics. As we continue to talk about our health economic study, we understand that some individual organizations have done some cost analysis activities of not having therapeutics available. What is the economic burden of that? We're curious to learn from your experiences there. Also understanding as we think about innovation, what are the important factors to patients? I think it's really important to remember that the patient experience really anchors everything that we do here. So getting those factors that are important to patients in the next generation of therapeutics and sort of where we're headed. Those are just a couple areas in which we will include in the survey. It will evolve as we continue to have more discussions here. So there will likely be more to include in that survey. So with that, I will turn it back over to Robin.
Just thank you very much. It was a very brisk run through.